Now, mesothelioma is a cancer that generally starts in the lungs and is caused by contact with asbestos. It's a familiar problem in Scotland, where generations of men worked in the shipyards, for example, and there are compensation schemes for them. But what about those who are exposed to the asbestos through contact with their relatives? Their access to compensation is considerably less. Trish Doig explains how she contracted the illness.
I think I came into contact with asbestos when I stayed with my aunt and uncle in the 60s, because my uncle worked for the Dundee Boiler Covering Company and they worked with asbestos all the time. And I think that the fibres came home in his clothes. He would give me a lift to work in his little van, which was full of asbestos, and I think that was where my contact came from. I was shocked. I'd never heard of mesothelioma. I mean, who had? So when they told me I had this strange disease, and they couldn't really give me any prognosis because they didn't know anything about it.
Well, let's speak to Phyllis Craig, who's a Senior Welfare Rights Officer with Clydeside Action on asbestos. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
How many people do you think are in Trish Doig's position? How many people contracted it through other relatives, do you think?
I think secondary exposure is certainly a lot less than what it is for the people who had direct exposure, but it shouldn't mean that they are any less of a person who should be compensated for their condition.
And tell us then how the compensation works at the moment then.
Well, what would happen is that someone who has indirect exposure, either environmentally or domestic exposure, can apply to a scheme. The government had a scheme in 2008, and that would give a portion of what you would receive in civil damages. But remember, this is only for mesothelioma, so a lot of people who have asbestos-related lung cancer lose out altogether because they receive no compensation.
So there's a big difference between those affected directly who have mesothelioma and those who are secondary, and then there's another big difference between those who have other asbestos-related cancers. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's correct, because if we're talking about government scheme, the government scheme is open up to people who have mesothelioma, who have indirect exposure, but it's not opened up to people who have asbestos-related lung cancer. And you've also got civil damages, and the 2012 scheme, which is run by the insurers, is open for people who cannot pursue civil damages, but they must have had direct exposure. So that's not open to people who have indirect exposure, but it's also not open to people who have died of an asbestos condition like asbestos-related lung cancer.
In many cases, it must be quite difficult to prove that you were in direct contact with asbestos in certain areas. Is it because it might have happened sort of 50, 60 years ago, and you're saying, well, I'm sure it happened when I worked in the shipyards?
I think that's right. I think the latency period has a lot to do with it. But people do remember, like the lady says, she knew that her uncle had been working with asbestos. They just didn't know the dangers of it at that time. And I think that's happened to an awful lot more people than we actually realise.
So what would you like to see happen? Because we're talking about secondary mesothelioma this morning, but it's not necessarily that it would seem from what you're saying that you think needs looked at.
Well, I think that if the government are going to open up a scheme, the 2008 scheme should be open up to more than just mesothelioma. Mesothelioma most definitely should receive some sort of payment. But I think that if the insurance industry are putting money into a scheme, and that's the 2012 scheme, then it should be open up to women. These women should receive a full payment as if they were entitled to receive civil damages, but it should be opened up to everyone.
Phyllis Craig, this story, presumably because asbestos is no longer used, should run its course. If you open it up to other members of the family, that includes possibly children, it will be a long time before it runs its course, won't it?
But it's still running its course because asbestos is still in situ. So unless we have asbestos safely removed, then it's always going to cause a danger. One of the campaigns we have running just now is to have asbestos removed from our schools.
Well, Phyllis Craig, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. Senior Welfare Rights Officer with Clydeside Action on asbestos.